This is the My Campaign Coach podcast, where we talk about how to win elections. Every week, we let you hear straight from the best consultants, operatives, and candidates in the game, all for one reason, to help you win. For more information about how we can help you win, visit mycampaigncoach.com. Now, here's your host, Raj Schaefer.
Welcome to the How to Run for Office podcast from My Campaign Coach. Between now and the year 2020, the millennial generation is set to make up the largest block of voting age adults in American history, even passing the baby boomers. In spite of that, according to our next guest, it's a generation that Democrats aren't adequately deploying and Republicans are largely ignoring. If you ask most political operatives what the biggest unknown or threat is in the next decade, they'll tell you that it's demographic shifts. That's whether they're Democrats or Republicans. Both parties have historically been so bad at communicating with minorities, whether generational or racial, that the shifts coming in the years ahead rightly concern both of them. But not much positive action seems to be coming out of this concern. In this episode, we're talking about how to fix that. Before we introduce our guest, though, I want to say thank you to Campaign Sidekick for supporting this podcast. In the years I've been involved with this product, I've seen it grow from a small shop that a few people had heard about to a professional powerhouse. It's one of just 6 data and technology vendors approved by the Republican National Committee. They've tested it and given it their stamp of approval. And it's being used by everything from statewide campaigns and state GOPs to precinct chairs on the grassroots level. Visit campaignsidekick.vote to find out how their best-in-breed voter contact platform can revolutionize your campaign and help you win. Give them a shout and set up a demo. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. This week, we're having Bonnie Siegel back on the podcast to talk about the millennial problem and how Republicans can win with millennials. Bonnie first joined us in episode 36, talking about her background in corporate branding and how she did groundbreaking political branding work on the Ted Cruz presidential campaign. Before bringing her principles of branding into the political space, Bonnie spent more than a decade designing and executing some of the most successful brand campaigns in the corporate arena. When Senator Cruz decided to run for president in 2016, he knew he'd need some outside-the-box strategies in order to be competitive in a wide field, and bringing Bonnie into the campaign was a key part of that calculus. Since the end of Cruz's presidential campaign, Bonnie launched Political Branding Associates and has been advising conservative campaigns and initiatives on how to build and maintain their brand. I've seen her work up close on a number of occasions and have been incredibly impressed. I'm sure you will be too. Now let's get to the interview and talk about how Republicans can win with millennials. Bonnie, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, it was great. We had you on on episode 36 about a year ago, and we talked a lot about your background and how you were the brand strategist for Ted Cruz's campaign and some of the really innovative things that you guys were doing, taking your background in the marketing for-profit space in branding and turning that onto the political side and how that was kind of revolutionizing some things there. Before we get into talking about our topic today, which is millennials, for new listeners and folks that haven't yet listened to 36, they should all go back and listen to it. But give us a little kind of an overview of your background and how you got into this field before we jump into the millennial problem.
Thanks, Raj. So I think the most important thing for your listeners is to know that what I did was come from the corporate world. And I was brought in to the Cruz campaign sort of in a unique approach to really delivering an individual, a campaign, an overall body to the marketplace in a way in which I don't think politics had ever really looked at individuals as a brand. And when I was brought in to do that, it was really an interesting ride simply because, one, I was sort of new to the marketplace relative to the political world, but very, very seasoned on the corporate side. And I was able to really borrow best practices from the corporate world in really looking at the senator in a way that probably people didn't think about him, or in a way in which people had not necessarily perceived him. And what a brand really does is it illustrates and it defines an individual in a way that they can then speak to certain issues, certain backgrounds, certain policies in a way that probably people hadn't thought about it before. So the beauty about Senator Cruz and branding his campaign and developing the courageous conservative movement that we did to define the overall goals and objectives that he had was to really then dig deeper into how do we define a brand personality, his own brand identity, his own brand, I would call it brand perception, on what people thought of him, and really moving the dial so that not only people who had heard of him before, but certainly people who were being acquainted with him as he was on the campaign trail would have a real clear understanding of who he is and what he stands for. And if you remember back when we spoke, I mean, he is a man who has tremendous conviction, perseverance, and real relevance in the marketplace. I think that he has been able to carve out a niche for himself even since the presidential campaign as being a very strong conservative who sticks to the values that he, in essence, brought to the market back in 2015 and 16, and certainly now as he's moving forward in his Senate race, which I'm very confident he will do very, very well in Texas, especially with his new brand strategy or his new brand promise, which is really to be tough as Texas. So all of those components play into, I think, what's sort of the new normal for politics. And as you know, I had started Political Branding Associates following that campaign in order to bring these tools and tactics to the marketplace for other candidates, incumbents, and other members of organizations who are looking to even strive to develop their own messaging and strategy in a way that becomes more relevant. So that sort of leads us into today's conversation about millennials, which is obviously a group of people, 60 million in total, actually, one of the largest voting blocks we'll have this fall, and where they fall in relationship to party politics, where they fall in relationship to their own life experiences, and how they perceive the political process. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this today.
Well, I am as well. But before we get into that specifically, you mentioned the brand promise, and there are a couple other facets that help make up a brand. Real quick, before we talk about how we need to brand for millennials, what are those key parts of an actual brand that people need to have in their mind as we talk about this?
Well, I think in general, if you go back a few years, maybe even prior to the 2016 election, and even looking at the Trump election of him being his own brand, all of a sudden now that's a really hot buzzword, like what's a brand?
Right.
Well, a brand promise, for lack of a better way of looking at it, was probably the way in which most campaigns developed their slogan. And unfortunately, if the slogan just is catchy or in essence, just puts together some really exciting words, but really do not reflect the individual that it's representing, it always falls flat. And you cannot put a round peg into a square hole. And ideally, a lot of campaigns that I have been witnessing and certainly working with, and now with our consulting practice growing as quickly as it is, I'm sort of getting this feeling that most people were trained to just develop a website, come up with a logo, make it look good, and then kind of come up with 3 or 4 words that they can sort of attach to the brand or attach to the candidate and hope that it sticks. But a true brand process really digs deeper, not only into the individual's personality, but to the issues that they are moving forward with. It goes into the essence of the person so that you can rely on that individual to really live that brand strategy or that brand promise in a way that's not unique to them, but is very much in alignment with them. And therefore, even under stress or under situations where they're tired on the road, they don't fall off the wagon because they are really living who they are. So the best way to be able to build a brand is to really start from scratch and understanding what are the elements of personality, identity, image, perception, the things that are either out in the marketplace already, for instance, if it's an incumbent, and maybe you need to sort of move a dial a certain direction, or if it's somebody brand new to the race, and you really have to develop some brand awareness for them because nobody's ever heard of them. So all of those components, what I would call defining factors in building the overall brand, then become a major attribute down the road for us to exercise and to execute against for anything that we do, whether it be push pieces or printed pieces or social media or the website, events that we do, donor development, all that falls under, is it supportive of the brand? And that gets defined by a process, not by just accident.
Well, I think part of why that's so important for us to start out with is that I think that misunderstanding of how you build a brand, do you start with a catchy slogan and then work the candidate, kind of shape the candidate around that or try to plug it in? Or do you start with the candidate or the issue and build a brand value set and a promise that are an outgrowth of them or really the embodiment of them? Those two ways of looking at the problem seem...
Certainly the latter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I think if you look at it, Raj, the first way, looking at it as just building a catchy phrase, is a product for failure. I think really trying to develop the brand first and then creating elements of it or messaging components that support that brand is probably the much more sophisticated way to go to market and a much higher standing in being able to win a race.
Well, and after reading several of your posts and articles, what you've been writing about millennials, I think that part of the issue is that we're coming at it from that wrong perspective, or the party and conservatives have been approaching this millennial problem from the wrong way. We're not trying to build a brand that is appealing. We're building a brand that's a true outgrowth of who we are that appeals to them. We're trying to basically cobble together and change and morph into whatever we think people want at the moment. And so tell me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like that's part of the approach problem that we're having with millennials.
Well, I think first and foremost, I don't think either party has significantly spent enough time really understanding millennials. First and foremost, they are different than boomers in every which way you can imagine. The way they live their life, the way they look at the world, the way they perceive value. They are a generation that really relishes on authenticity. They hate bullshit. They love the fact that they can live their life with certain experiences. They are less interested, per se, in maybe stuff as they are in experiencing, what's the best avocado toast. I mean, the truth is, regardless of demographic financially, millennials have a very unique perspective on what's important to them. Work-life balance is very important to them. You'll hear words like self-care is really important to them. You'll hear words like, well, I'm not interested in buying a home because I want to be mobile and flexible in case I want to pick up and move. They are not as committed or dedicated to staying on a job for 10, 15, 20 years. As a matter of fact, it's just the opposite. They would perceive that as being unsuccessful if they couldn't move from one place to another, sort of climbing that ladder slowly but surely. I think they're an extremely talented group of people. Most of them are pretty well educated, and they are technology. I mean, they are the generation of technology, which is really the next level of our own next industrial revolution is going to be based on who succeeds with technology and how do we use it to benefit our future. So with all of those components, if you think about, let's say, even the Republican Party, who'd always lived under this mindset of, wait till they get married, have 2 kids, buy a house, and can't deduct their mortgage, they'll become a Republican. It's not happening in that time frame. So you have this huge vacuum of young people, most of them now up until the age of sort of 20 to 37 right now would be that millennial genre, the ones who can vote now, or 18 to 37 is sort of the range that we're in right now. These individuals have a very different perspective on what's important to them, and the Republican Party is not speaking to them in a language that they understand. Now, I recently composed an article. Basically, the title was "The Democrats Have Not Harnessed Them," because they seem to be leaning left, and the Republicans are totally ignoring them. And the truth is I think we are, as a party, ignoring them. We have not changed our phraseology. We're not communicating to them in a language that makes sense. We seem to say the same thing the same way over and over again, and as all of us know, if you behave the same way, you're going to get the same results. And therefore, I don't think we're spending the time necessary to grow not only our strategy, but our perspective on how these individuals can have a major impact on both parties. And right now, I think the Republicans are losing in creating an opportunity for themselves to really develop a relationship with these young people. And I don't think it's going to be business as usual in 10 years, which is what I think they anticipate, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's time to do something.
I think you're very right on that, and I'm definitely going to link to all these articles that folks can read in their long form. But one of the things that, when we were talking last week on the phone, something that kind of shocked me and then made total sense as I was considering it later, was that as you were talking about the way we need to change our terminology, not change what we believe, but change how we're communicating that for millennials. You talked about how that even using words like liberty, they mean something totally different, or they're meaningless to millennials, given the way that I grew up talking about it or something like that. And part of that's because of the fact that they haven't grown up believing they knew anything but that liberty and freedom. Talk a little bit about how important it is that we understand the differences in words.
Right. Liberty is a perfect example as to really concentrate on most people don't use that terminology in their everyday language. So it's not like we wake up and say, give me liberty. We don't speak in those terms. So when you have a generation or even multiple generations who really have not experienced any type of war, like maybe even since the Vietnam War, which of course was not a victory for the United States, so there was no quote-unquote liberty brought from that. We are poised to change the way in which we speak to what independence or freedom or liberty is, simply because these young people have never, like you just mentioned, have ever experienced anything other than freedom. They, even in their travels, although they might go to countries or nations that don't have the same freedoms or laws that we have, they still come home to the safety net of this amazing country. And the truth is although they're experiencing it for a week or two somewhere in their travels or their adventure, they still come home and realize, well, this is home and this is what I'm used to. And they don't connect the dots of how lucky they are. They don't really see how incredibly successful the concept of freedom and liberty really brings to their day-to-day lives, because they've never had anything other than that. If you meet immigrants who come to this country who are coming from countries where there is no freedom or liberty, those are the people who usually become actually steadfast Republicans, because they really relish in the fact that this is something that they can't take for granted. Whereas, unfortunately, the millennials don't have that ever present in their minds. In addition to that, there's other ways in which we use language that are not successful for us. For instance, the Democrats have labeled themselves liberal and progressive, and the Republicans have branded themselves as conservative and disciplined. Well, if I'm 18 years old and I'm heading to college for the first time in my life, or I just graduated high school and I'm out there really excited to have my first job and I'm moving out of my house, what's going to be much more attractive to them from a language standpoint, liberal and progressive or conservative and disciplined? I mean, do people go on college campuses and say, oh, let me get on that conservative discipline line. That sounds really fun, right? So just by virtue on how we have been accepting, how we've branded either ourselves or been branded, we are now in a spin to get out of the negativity of what that means to be conservative and disciplined or principled. Right? It doesn't sound fun. Now, obviously, somebody in the 50s or 60s will say, well, life's not fun, and therefore we can't always communicate in the language of fun. But the truth is, liberal and progressive is much more exciting to a young person who might have some ideologies of their own and are just sort of building their own mindset as to what life will look like for them. That in itself captures their attention. So in the most simplistic way, we have already used language in the wrong way to represent the Republican Party, because it's the opposite of, in their minds, liberal and progressive. And yet I feel it's probably much more progressive and much more liberal than the Democrats are. But we, unfortunately, have begun to use language which we accept, and that language is hurting us. That's just one simple example of how branding can make such a big difference on how people perceive you, and how something gets perceived when they don't know all the facts.
Well, you're right. It's making a huge difference. One of the things that, reading a couple paragraphs here, I want to quote from your blog about how Democrats are not harnessing them and Republicans are ignoring millennials. Herein lies the first hurdle and the fundamental problem. What do millennials believe they're responsible for fixing? Previously you've been talking about the things that they don't want to fix. Well, like every generation before them, they want good jobs, they want great opportunities, and they want a cycle of poverty to end. They want dignity, integrity, and earned respect, yet they haven't figured out that all of the above does not come from government intervention. No, instead, it is stifled by government intervention. So I think you've done well as far as identifying the central problem there. Let's talk about how we start changing language and how we should approach this branding problem and start to make some changes that better communicate with millennials.
Well, I mean, I think, thanks for quoting that piece. I mean, the problem with the concept of government intervention, which is truly what we are trying to unravel with this new White House, the problem with government intervention is millennials perceive it as a healthy dose of helping people, instead of them understanding how it's restrictive and it holds our values back and being able to make decisions on our own. they have already kind of gotten into this camp of believing, well, if the government doesn't do it, who will? They have not yet graduated that it could be them that actually changes the future of poverty or changes the way in which we engage in every issue affecting us. Now, there are always going to be differences of opinion on certain issues, but let's talk about guns for a second, okay? You're in Texas. Very, very, very strong red state. I'm sure it will stay that way. I hope it will stay that way. I think that Senator Cruz has done a fantastic job of speaking to what the Second Amendment represents for us. But the truth is, no one, even including the senator, is speaking about what the real problem is right now. And I'm not disagreeing with him. I'm just adding to a potential argument he could make, is that it isn't guns that kill people, it's people that kill people. And the truth is that's a mental health issue in this country. And I think if the Republicans would take that leap of faith to change the conversation from guns and speak to a much broader issue that we have, which is mental health, all of a sudden, by just changing the conversation, you could potentially be resolving a problem that's bigger than any of us can solve in a day or two. But consistently fighting about gun control and taking my guns away or not allowing me to have a gun when you've got obviously shootings around the country, and if it was any but one of our high school children, I think you know what line we would be standing on if, God forbid, our child got shot going to school, which is supposed to be the safest place for a kid to go. We have to ask ourselves, what can we put in place to be able to deliver a result that's different than just saying, you know, good people deserve to have guns if they want it. Well, yeah, we get that, but that's not resolving the problem. And the truth is if we can start speaking about it from a broader standpoint, not only would we look more relevant, which is clearly what I think millennials are looking for. They're looking for relevance. They don't understand that government intervention is not the way to go. So we can speak to that and speak to how we can actually transform this issue to be maybe more of a state conversation, a church conversation, a community conversation, an addiction issue conversation, and a mental illness, anxiety, and depression conversation. Then all of a sudden we might be solving for the real problem instead of just fighting based on partisan, I would call them partisan language, which doesn't necessarily help solve the problem. Millennials look to resolve things. They want to fix it.
So it seems like part of what you're saying there, the crux of the matter is that in the issue of guns, that our biggest downfall is that we've accepted the terms, we've kind of accepted the framing of the argument that liberals have made, which is guns are bad. Instead of pushing back and saying that's not actually what we're talking about here, this is the real problem. Instead of trying to rebrand that issue, we've accepted their framing of it.
Exactly. And that's the power of branding. Because the way you communicate and the way you use language allows people to either get on your train or get off your train. And we are not allowing for people to join and get on a train because, to your point, which was just so well made, we're not addressing the actual reason for the language, which we have been, unfortunately, made the bad guys. Right? We are the party of no. You can't have this. You can't have that. No, we don't do that. This is not right. And they are the party of yes. Let's give them everything. Let's make college free. Let's make sure that people don't own guns. Let's make sure that everybody can do whatever they want whenever they want to. When you think about it in those terms, again, how do we engage millennials to embrace the fact that we can come up with solutions and we're not using the same language that we used 15, 20 years ago, which honestly is not working. It's just not working. We have to rebrand the entire process in order for us to be able to communicate in a language that's understandable and one that looks like it's moving the project forward instead of just being stuck in saying the same thing over and over again, thinking you're going to get a different response, but you're not.
Well, at the end of that article that we quoted from earlier, I'm going to quote the last paragraph. You said, we need to retell our story in ways where we can reach our millennials who have lived the last 20 years with relatively few interruptions to their lives. The way to rebrand the Republican Party is to begin with the truth. We need to change the conversation and begin to harness as well as secure the next generation of millennial leadership so that our story is told fairly and correctly, with all the benefits them if we begin the process of rebranding the Republican Party for what it really can mean to millennials and how it can elevate their lifestyle, we will change the conversation. So I think that really sums up and kind of crystallizes the problem we face. What kind of things, I'm just thinking about this from the campaign perspective and from the meta side, what are things that we need to start doing differently? I know these are not simple questions, but what are some of the ideas that you have at this point as far as ways that on a individual or smaller campaign level we can start trying to gain some traction in that rebranding on the small side?
Well, I always think that solving or communicating with solutions is almost always better than just always stating the problem, right? So I do believe that both parties have done a very poor job of coming up with solutions. They tend to just hang on the problem, thinking that that's sort of the red meat they could throw to get people's attention. So the first thing we have to do is really develop, as a party, solutions to some of these components that are not going away. I mean, we just saw most recently the Supreme Court judgment on the baker and what happened with the gay couple who was not served cake. I mean, that was a very big issue during the campaign in 15 and 16 as to what would happen with that. And I would say that, at the end of the day, people can interpret the ruling in lots of different ways. But the point is we are not going to change certain people's minds on that topic. But at the same time, we can still work hard to keep individual roles and liberties and freedoms intact in order to make sure that this country doesn't go off the rails. So there's an interesting example of something that got fought a certain way, got ruled a different way, and the outcome was obviously what more of the right or the Republican Party would have wanted from that ruling. In addition to that, though, if you look at guns or if you look at schools or you look at health care, these are issues that are continuously haunting us because we have not yet found the language to speak about them. Going back to this notion of changing the conversation regarding guns to possibly being more of a conversation of solving for mental health, I think can happen by the individual who potentially is running for office, hopefully with a reason to make change. It starts with the campaign and understanding how to phrase things in a way that doesn't put us into the buckets or in the corners that we've been put in. I mean, ideally, it may sound great to the grassroots to constantly use the word conservative leader, but when you use the word conservative over and over again, I don't believe you're expanding your grassroots base because millennials are not buying into that. Now, of course, there are some young people who are Republicans, and of course, the College Republican National Committee is doing a terrific job in trying to really embrace what's happening on college campuses. But in general, those are very small numbers in relationship to the millennials as a whole. And I think warning signs have to be thrown out there to say, what are we going to do to seize this moment and speak to these individuals who are highly educated, very well respected, and have positions on certain things in a way that they can hear us to say, wait, I never thought about it that way, or I never understood that the Second Amendment wasn't about killing people. I thought, I had no idea it was about protecting us from our own government. Most of these people don't even realize why we have a Second Amendment law. They just look at it as guns and gun control. And therefore, if they can't have a gun, it would be safer. If they do have a gun, it's a problem, instead of really understanding the roots of what happened. And we take for granted that they know why our forefathers created the Second Amendment to be so important in our lives because of the history. And the fact that if you go back in history, most nations that do not have, where people do not have the ability to own a gun are very, very limited in their scope of rules and laws that they can act upon, right? I mean, you think people in Iran are walking around with guns, or people in Venezuela are walking around with guns, or people in China are walking around with guns? I mean, obviously those dictatorships or types of governments where they don't allow people to have the freedoms that we have would never allow it, but it's not because they're worried that they're going to kill each other. They just don't want anybody to create a coup and take over the government.
Right.
Here we're safe in making sure we can protect ourselves from that. Nobody's talking about that. And that's really the story. That's really the reason. And if we don't educate our young people to understand why certain things were done at a certain period of time, we will never get them to get on this train to understand it's a good direction and they should be coming with us. We don't want them fighting us. We want them joining us. So how do we get them on board? And that is to really speak to them with storytelling and with branding that actually reflects the real reasons why we have these particular laws and policies and why they're important to respect and keep. Lots of things. I mean, look at what's happening with our own flag, right? That's a branding issue. Many of us see that flag as a brand that represents the freedom of this country, and anything that doesn't honor it is disrespectful to us. Others look at it and say, well, if the country's not treating people right, I'm going to disrespect the flag. I mean, you're always going to have two arguments coming together. We have to be able to tell our story in a more impactful way.
So it seems like part of what you're saying there is that we have been approaching the conversion of millennials to our ideology as basically saying we're going to brute force this problem. We're going to keep saying the same thing over and over again, using the same words and same tactics over and over again, and eventually we're going to get success, rather than approach it from the perspective of acknowledging our own ignorance and saying that we got to ask some questions. We don't understand the problem. We don't understand how they talk or how they would best hear from us. And my dad always taught me growing up that communication is not about what I say, it's what you hear. And so if I'm saying something you're not hearing right, that's my problem, not yours. So first and foremost, we got to take ownership over the problem, which is that we're not saying the right things. And that doesn't mean that we don't have the right beliefs. It's about how we're saying it.
Right. I mean, and I grew up in a house where my dad said it's not what you're saying, it's the way you're saying it. Right? So all of us, and I think those are two wise phraseologies to understand that we are not communicating with millennials. We are not relevant. We are not resonating with them. We are not giving them a reason to understand that their long-term future would really benefit from driving an economy and jobs and a healthcare program that might ultimately be better if it was not forced down people's throats. I mean, or a government-run healthcare program, which would ultimately potentially be a disaster for this country. They can't even get, their voting polls right. So reality is we are not communicating in exactly the way in which we have to be able to compel them to see an aha moment and say, wait a second, I never saw it that way. I didn't think it that way. Because we just say the same thing over and over again. Repeal Obamacare, pull out of the Iran deal, obviously Second Amendment, liberty, freedom, justice, right? That is not something that's in their ballywick right now. I think jobs and the economy and the future and capitalism is working and technology is exciting and there's many, many things we could be doing. We're not talking about building a wall as much as we're talking about safety and security, right? Change the conversation. Allow people to understand what the impact of those choices are based on the fact of what the outcome will be. And I think we would potentially start to chip away at the negativity that we have held for so long and almost accept it as a party. Like, we are the party of no. It shouldn't be that way. It should be, we are the party of yes. Yes, you can have this. Yes, you can achieve this. Yes, you can grow to enjoy this. Yes, you can mature into developing this. That's the kind of country we live in. And I think that's important that we come back to those roots and stop using the same language that we've used before, because it's not working.
So on that topic, is it also important that we pick, as far as the issues that we're pushing on, that we select issues where we have the table stacked in our favor when it comes to them agreeing with us, like things like Uber or city councils putting crazy regulations on Airbnb, stuff where they're already keyed in, they're already hot on the issues and saying, hey, well, this is actually an opportunity for us to talk about property rights. This is how we should talk about innovation. Yeah. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Oh, my God, exactly what I'm saying. I mean, let's talk about Airbnb or Uber. I mean, Uber was a disruptive force, right? It came into the marketplace. Nobody expected it. Nobody would have ever dreamt of it. But once they had it, they don't want to give it up. It gave them access. It gave them freedom. It was ease of service. I mean, all of the things that millennials love. That's exactly the types of stories we should be telling now, especially since they've embraced those components. A smartphone, social media, freedom to talk on social media, not regulating social media, right? Because at that point, what would happen if the government starts getting involved in that? So these are all of the things that they have learned to love. We should absolutely use those as examples of what would happen if the government got involved and started taking those opportunities away. Same thing with Airbnbs. These people are not staying in hotels. They are loving life to live, and they're very happy to stay in someone else's home in any city they go to, and it works just fine for them. There are people who are, using the commerce as a way to be able to lend out their lawnmower or, give them a snowblower. These are all elements of our capitalist system which absolutely behooves them, but we're not talking about all those wins because we let them sort of get plowed over. But what you just said is exactly what we should be talking about, explaining how it would impact them if those things were taken away from them, because that's front and center for them. That now makes sense to them. Can you imagine shutting down the internet in this country? Do they have any awareness that when I was in China, my internet went down every hour, almost every day? I mean, we would never accept that in this country, but we don't live in a rule of law like China. We live in America, but we don't realize how lucky we are because of that. So we don't want those types of regulations changing the way we can live our lives. Those are great examples, and there's many, many more besides those, things that millennials treasure and they care about. And at a certain point, they will potentially, earn higher wages and possibly be more conscious of the taxes that they're paying. But at this juncture right now, I think we have not done anything to even begin to entertain them as part of this party.
So on those issues where we have ideological agreement like Airbnb and Uber, we're going to millennials and we're trying to talk about how, say, hey guys, we're with you, and we want to give them the idea that there might be more common ground here than meets the eye or just on this narrow issue set. How should we approach that conversation as far as, you're talking about there are other areas. We don't want to fall into the same old messaging and branding traps of where we have been or where we are. We want to be moving that forward and talking more directly to them. But how do we make that transition from talking about the specific issue to maybe talking about the undergirding stuff like property rights or something like that might help show them all the other areas where we agree?
Well, if we're talking about just in general, the party platform has to address it. I think the Republican Party as a whole has to address it. I think that a lot of the messaging that comes out of the party, especially for donor development, in trying to get that next generation to be a part of an entity that's larger than themselves and maybe becoming donors, those who are in their mid-30s, who are still sort of on the borderline of millennial but have a lot at stake in moving their lives forward. It can happen through a campaign. It can happen through an individual candidate who's willing to speak about this in terms that's different than their normal Republican before them. I mean, if you go to any Republican page or you go to any Democratic page, chances are 9 out of the 10 things you're seeing are exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And one of the unique opportunities about branding is it should not be exactly the same. Although we are Republicans, or although someone else might be Democrat, they should be running on issues and on brand strategy components that define them and why they're running, rather than just copying and pasting the same jargon that we've used over and over and over again, which every Republican before them did. And people are deaf to it. They don't even hear it anymore. It doesn't at all even resonate. They just shut it down. They just shut it off. It's the same old, same old. So when you ask, what do? We start on local governments. We start in state governments. We start having the parties in those particular states start looking at the issues and thinking about ways in which to storytell them differently. It's reaching out on college campuses instead of ignoring college campuses because we feel like we're not welcome on them, which is the biggest mistake we could make. We should be doubling down and spending a lot more time communicating with college kids as to what the benefits are once they graduate and what some of the issues are that they may hit upon and what party would potentially solve them in what way. Those are the things that we should be doing immediately, whether it be from the National Republican Senate Committee, whether it be through individual governors who are coming into office with real strategies for their states. These are the opportunities that we have in changing that. And even if we talk about, to your point, individual issues in a new way, people will start to listen to it. It will all of a sudden become dinner conversation again, where people can say, I never really thought about Uber or B&B as being sort of the next wave of, our capitalist system where people can actually buy and sell things that are important to them. Well, that's really important to our system, and that is that next generation of the system. That is using technology in a way that was never done 50 years ago. Who would have ever thought you'd even have access to someone's personal home 50 years ago? And now you can see everyone's home online. So those things become built in. I mean, I would call them baked into our system moving forward. Let's talk about the benefits of keeping them and how they actually got to where they were because of the country and the systems that we have in place. That's where I think it's important.
So I think that raises in a really good way, one of the problems we're facing, in that when we look at whether it's consultants or campaigns, you talked about pretty much everybody copy and pasting the same type of stuff, same red meat, and basically running campaigns the same way. I think that part of that's because failing the same way everyone always has is totally fine. But failing in a different way, that's anathema. That makes you embarrassed. That means you don't get hired anymore as far as people's perceptions. Mm-hmm. And so everybody kind of understands that we're not doing a good job with millennials. But if I go out there and I try to start really doing something new to touch millennials or really any other group, then there's so much pushback on that because that's not the status quo. And no matter how much people understand that the status quo needs to change, actually changing it is a whole other bigger problem. So how do we, I guess what I'm hearing is that you're saying that on an individual basis, whether it's a person or a candidate, that we need to actually be thinking through how can we innovate in this space. We need to be practicing that innovation on a person-by-person basis in order to figure out what works, because there's not a prescriptive answer where you can tell me today, do these three things and we're going to win millennials. It's an individual by individual process.
Right, it is. And I can tell you that starting to speak in a language that's not saying the same thing over and over again the way you said it 20 years ago is a good start. So looking at each of the issues and finding a different pathway to communicate what your strategy is or what that overall impact will be, and using a language that explains it in a way that makes sense is your first start. I think we are so far down the road. We're on, the 13th mile marker of a marathon instead of starting at mile marker 1 and saying, okay, how do I rebuild this 26.2 miles in a way that people can join me 1 mile at a time? And that is truly what we have to do. We have to unfold this. We do have to retract it. We have to look at life and some of the verbiage differently. I know from this podcast moving forward, anyone who's listened to it will start to become much more of a detective to, gosh, that is the same way we've said it over and over and over again. And there's got to be a better way to brand what we're trying to say or do so that people will see it or hear it differently. Start with just the basics. What a push card says, what your website says, how you're really thinking about looking at life differently. Speak about the Uber, speak about the Airbnb, speak about social media, speak about Facebook. These are the tools that millennials use, and they use it in every which way. I mean, our own president has mastered Twitter, right? So he himself is using a means that could either embrace millennials or lose millennials. But either way, regardless of whether they're following him, like him, or don't like him, the point being is this is now our next generation of communication. We do it in sound bites. So if it has to be in a sound bite, make every word matter. Make sure that you're explaining things in a way that will capture their attention. They read headlines, which is why the media is so dangerous in how they can potentially sculpt a conversation in a way that is not getting the point across, because they know that's what sells, right? I once was at a meeting with a media consultant, and I thought what she said was really fascinating, so I'll share it with you and your listeners. She said that usually when a media person asks you a question, if you repeat the question is armed, meaning, did you have anything to do with this person losing his house? Let's put it that way. And that person says, I had nothing to do with that person losing their house. Headline. He said he had nothing to do with losing the house. They never read the article. Okay, so now they're saying, oh, he's lying, right? He said he didn't do it. If he didn't say he didn't do it, I'd probably believe him more than him saying he didn't do it. So that's the headline. So fascinating how we get caught into these cycles of being pigeonholed, and we have to learn how to communicate in a way that's more effective so that we don't get bantered like that. And that's just a simple example of what the media can do on an interview. Can you imagine what they're doing, on a bigger scale and trying to persuade where a market moves or where an election moves? I mean, let's be honest, they are a huge persuasive force. And for the soundbite being written on, on a millennial smartphone where they're just getting the headlines, those headlines is how they're learning and behaving based on a headline. They're not reading the whole article. They don't have time. So fascinating on how we're also educating them. We have to find a way to make our headlines more impactful so that they at least pay attention or see it differently. We have to do that. No one's going to do that for us.
So one of the things that I've seen as I've talked with folks about reach out to millennials or any other current minority is there's a feeling that, well, if I change my branding to appeal better to them, what about my existing customers? You don't want to run into a new Coke problem or what in-house IHOP just rebranded as IHOb yesterday, and I think they're going to see a similar thing. Yeah. So we don't want to have that same problem, right? We feel like Republicans looking at it and say, well, we don't millennials aren't the biggest yet. They're soon to be. It's a growing problem, but we still got boomers and we got all these donors, and if we change our messaging a whole lot now, well, won't we just lose them? How do we actually keep where we got these two audiences?
So the question becomes, is by changing the language or changing the way you explain it, the truth is it should actually even enhance those who are already baked or built into why they do what they do. It gives them additional reasons for it. It shouldn't take them away from it because you're not changing the outcome. If anything, you're just dissecting your ability to explain it in a way that makes it more user-friendly for somebody who's not yet there. So when I think about grassroots or I think about my initial supporters, I'm not telling them that I ever want to give away my Second Amendment rights. I'm just trying to get others to understand what those rights really mean in a broader context so that a millennial who's not already on board with it can have a sense of thinking through the conversation and thinking through the variable components and making a decision for themselves, which actually may have them cross the street. But saying it the same exact way just to keep the people who are already on board is not necessarily helping them, and it's not broadening the base, and it's not opening the tent, and it's not getting us where we need to be. It is just so partisan at this point that even the issues that we feel are deeply embedded into the Republican Party's platform are unfortunately haven't been revised or renewed or refreshed. I'm not saying make it Coke Zero, but I am saying say it in a way, as we just talked about it, that it addresses the ultimate outcome, and that is the fact that most people who choose to take a gun and kill somebody, especially in these mass shootings, have a lot of personal mental health issues. So why aren't we trying to come up with a way to manage that issue? Right? It's not only about giving teachers guns. I mean, those are Band-Aids. That's not fixing a problem. What we have to be able to do is set up the dollars and the money necessary on a state level to really develop programs that have teachers identify deranged kids who are really, really having a problem in school, and not pushing them along so that ideally they then come out and do something crazy. So we have other issue that I think affects the Second Amendment or the gun issue, and that's what I'm saying. Now, many people may or may not agree with me that is the issue that I've identified as the true brand problem, but I do think it opens up then an opportunity for conversation about it. And it will develop even new ways of thinking about how they want to sell their views just by virtue of the fact that we're talking about it from a different angle. And those things matter most right now. Your podcast matters because it opens it up for people to listen to things and to talk about it in a way that they may not have thought about it before. Those are the things that make a difference in moving a dial for a brand. Allowing that awareness to come out so that it becomes a conversation that is not forced on anyone, but instead of that being introduced to everyone, which I think is a problem that we're not addressing right now.
It seems like on an individual, on a personal basis, that one of the biggest things that we can do to help change some of that culture is to really focus on listening and leading through Socratic questions. And I've always been a huge fan of the way the Socratic method works. Is, you're asking questions, and by that you're understanding more about what the other person believes, which gives you a better ability to talk to them and communicate effectively. But it allows that person it really forces that person to crystallize what they believe as they're having to say it. Because in order to articulate your belief, you have to really think about it and crystallize it down to a very fine form, which is something that I think is so far underused, because most of our political conversation today with somebody that might not agree 100%, they sound like a Fox News or an MSNBC segment where we're just battling back and forth without the real end goal of moving someone to our side. We just want to defeat them.
Right. We want to kill. It's like going to war. It's sort of like who's going to have the most ammo, who's going to be the brightest, who's going to be the wittiest, who's going to make that last phrase a catch-all.
Yeah.
And really, to your point, it doesn't develop a long-term strategy. All it does is allow people to sort of banter back and forth, and it turns everyone off, and it specifically turns off millennials. I mean, because they are young and they haven't yet figured out where do they stand or where do they want to be, and depending on what's being said, if it's said the same way over and over again, they've already tuned it out. But if they heard something a little bit differently, if we explained it in a way that gave them reason to come on board, again, stop talking about liberty. They don't understand what liberty is. Start talking about freedom in a way that really develops their understanding of what it's like elsewhere, what it could be like if we didn't hold on to these ideals, and truly how it affects their day-to-day life. The fact that they can go online and buy something, the fact that they can rent somebody else's house, the fact that they can buck, a medallion yellow taxi system in New York and still be able to, because that was certainly something that nobody thought that anybody would ever be able to go beyond the politics or lobbying of that, and walk out of a Starbucks and catch an Uber in New York City. I mean, those are the things that people want to do. Talk about how those things could be taken away, and then all of a sudden people can pay attention. So it's how we move that dial in explaining what the outcome could or would be if we didn't hold on to these ideals, if we didn't treasure the fact that this country has blessed us with so much privilege and that we don't want to lose that privilege. Even the conversation about poverty or, the multi-generational poverty that we see in this country, really stop saying that it's about welfare per se and come up with solutions that sort of change the dial to it. Force people to work. Give them opportunities for schooling. Give them an opportunity to change. Now, I may sound like a Democrat in saying that, but I'm really not. I'm actually speaking to issues that are not going to go away unless the Republicans, who are very, very bright people, come up with a different way to communicate how to solve for those problems. And once we do that, I think we're going to get a lot more attention from the potential independents, and even that is an interesting format, which we didn't touch upon yet in the podcast, of how many young people call themselves independents, which is just another declaration on their part is they don't want to be a part of either of these places because they're so negative to them. So they've created their own real base of, I'll just be an independent, which gives me an opportunity to really live my life the way I see myself anyway, free from everybody else, and just doing things the way I want. So here, that actually is attractive to them, again, because it's not a Democrat and it's not a Republican. They found a different camp to sit in, even though they're leaning left.
So once we've identified, or we've said, okay, yes, we have to win millennials. Well, once we've acknowledged that problem that we have to solve, and once we said, okay, maybe I'm open to this idea of changing the way I speak, it makes sense that I might have to talk in a little bit different way to a different audience, I still think that, especially after we've seen the Republicans create their own internal branding problem with, instead of changing the way they talked about something in the past, they just changed what they were fighting for or talked about. So many of the establishment side have sold out the grassroots time and time again, saying whatever they thought they wanted to hear or whatever. Now, I think
but
there's
good
this attitude.
Branding, let me just stop you for a second, because good branding doesn't mean you say whatever somebody wants to hear. It's just
Right.
the opposite of that, actually. Right, okay.
Well, but I think that what the Republican Party has done a uniquely bad job of this branding in the last several years, even within our existing voter base. And so you've got grassroots folks. I think the big fear that some of our listeners may have is they're hearing this, say, okay, I want to fix the problem. I want to talk in a different way. But if I do, the grassroots are primed to, if I start changing my language, that it's going to too easily be able to put me in a category of say, well, he's just selling out. How do we guard against that as we shift some of this branding?
Well, I think that's a really valid point, and I don't know necessarily if telling the truth or developing a platform that really covers a broader base of what the subject matter is, dependent on the subject matter, should alienate somebody in the grassroots. I don't think that's selling out. I think that's really coming up with sticking to your guns and making sure that you want to hold on to them, but at the same time explaining all the reasons why those are inherent in our process and why they're inherent in the future of these young people's success. I think tying things together and leaning back and leaning in to be able to develop a dialogue that speaks to it beyond just the obvious, I don't see that as alienating our base. If anything, I think that should encourage our base to be able to grow it, right? We're not looking to stay the same size. We're looking to grow. We're looking to expand. We're looking to have better opportunity. And I think that lays back to our Hispanic and Black issue on the Republican side. I think it lays back to us not developing relationships with people outside of our normal base. I think these are all things that expand our opportunity to grow. I don't see them as negatives, and I don't see myself per se to be labeled as a moderate for even saying that. I mean, if it's moderate to actually try to expand your base, well, that's pretty crazy. That should be the radical thing, right? So most importantly, I think it's important to develop, depending on the subject matter, talking points that speak to outcome and less about that red meat, giving people an understanding of the broader spectrum as to why. So if you wanted to really use a tactic, why do I want this? Why do I want to repeal Obamacare? Why do I want to keep guns the way they are? Why do I want to allow people to make religious liberty choices? If I want to speak in that language, let's not use red meat, but let's use the reasons, the impact, what would happen if we lost that, what it would look like, and solve for the problems that are really part of the problem instead of solving for things that have nothing to do with the problem. So talking about, how many rounds of ammo somebody can have, I mean, that might be most important to people who are extremely, extremely, dedicated to the Second Amendment, but it's not an argument that a millennial cares about right now. So let's talk about what they do care about, and that is young people not being shot in school. How do we potentially bite into a new apple to say this is what we have to be solving for? And why would it be anti-Republican to solve for a major issue that's affecting our country right now? Why is that negative? That's positive, right? If we're actually looking to solve for it.
So it seems like what you're saying there is that as we are rebranding and working towards cultivating a relationship with millennials, we also have to change the way that we're communicating with our existing supporters in how we message that change in branding. That we have to be very careful that we're telling them why we're doing this. Be intentional about explaining why and showing how we're not.
Yeah, and I don't think that it changes what they're necessarily going to ultimately want, which is we're not changing our position. We're changing the way we explain our position, right? I'm not asking anyone to change their positioning. I think the positioning is solid. I'm asking them to change the way in which they communicate it, how they storytell it, how they expand it so that people can have a better understanding of it and not keep it in that same box, because that box is not working anymore. It's just not. Now, it may I have had campaign managers tell me, Bonnie, we just have to keep it simple and keep it conservative and keep it disciplined and keep it focused because that's what our base looks for. But I don't agree with that. I mean, I'm stepping out of that box to say I don't agree that is the way you're going to expand elections in this country for the Republican Party. I think you are going to see things shrinking because people are not the next generation coming up, which is a 60 million person voter block. Let me be honest with you. If they all voted, we would be in big trouble. Now, you have many people who are still sitting on the laurel saying, well, they don't vote anyway, so it doesn't matter. Well, but they will at some point.
Right.
And, okay, they will at some point. And then what are you going to do when we are already witnessing the divisiveness? I mean, the severe divisiveness of the parties. It is so tribal right now, it's unbelievable, which is a whole other conversation we can have, that you can't get somebody who's a D to become an R or an R a D. At least try to take a millennial who hasn't put their stake in the ground yet and get them to your side before they become a D, because then they're not going to switch. What we're seeing is people are not moving. We're not moving dials. Issues are not moving dials. People are not moving dials. it is so stuck where it is that actually what they're all hoping for is who's going to come out and vote. That is the best answer to what's going to happen in the polls. Well, it just depends on who comes out and votes.
Well, and as you said in one of your articles, half of millennials now describe themselves as politically independent. So there are about 30 million votes, you're saying, up for grabs, basically.
I think they're up for grabs. Yep. I think they're leaning left, and I think they're leaning left because the Republicans are doing nothing. They're ignoring them totally. I think that there's a ton of them that, given the proper attention with the proper talking points and a real understanding of really what the Republican Party as a whole stands for, what the ultimate goal is, what are they working towards, what's the finish line look like, they would be much more open to the Republican Party. But we're not spending any time with them, and this is a perfect opportunity for us to really start thinking about this on a big level. I've spent the last few months becoming a true student of the millennials. I have read everything you possibly can read about how they behave, what they do, why they do the things they do, why they eat where they eat, why certain things are important to them, why experiences are more important than things. All of those components are not changing. They are not going to change. They are becoming adults who have these very strong beliefs in certain areas, and we have to start to begin to entertain them to see something that they haven't seen before. And it's a problem, and we have to fix it.
Well, I think that knowledge comes through very clearly in these articles you wrote. They're very informative, and of course, the conversation today has been phenomenal. I always love getting to chat with you, and I always learn quite a bit. Do you have any final words of advice for folks, or any final thoughts as we're getting to the closing here?
I mean, I really believe that those who are sitting thinking that it is the same as it was 2-3 years ago, especially those who are running campaigns or actively involved in working with candidates, it is time to really incorporate branding into their modeling, and it's not wasted money, and you don't need another yard sign, because at the end of the day, you put up one more yard sign that's saying the same thing the wrong way, and it's not going to get you anywhere. It is truly about rebuilding a platform of opportunities through strategic thinking, through analytical understanding, through developing and reading the data and understanding the polling, and starting to embrace an entire entity that is coming up the files, ready to start making decisions in their life and really communicating to them from a candidate standpoint or a campaign standpoint in a way that they could actually be heard. And I really believe we have a lot of work to do, And that work is reliant on us. No one's going to do it for us. We have to do it ourselves.
I think you're right, and I really appreciate you helping catalyze a new conversation here. I'm hoping that your work will get a lot more attention, that folks will start adopting this attitude.
Well, I love talking to you, Raz. You're always prepared, and you always ask great questions, so I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. If folks want to find out more about you, they can go to politicalbrandingassociates.com or look you up on medium.com is where you post your blog articles. Medium.com/@Bonnie Siegel, BonnieSiegel is where you can find your blog articles. Any other places folks should check out your work?
I'd love them to just go to the website. We post all of our news and articles there, and certainly they're welcome to call, and I'm happy to have a conversation on a personal level with anyone who wants to sort of take this to the next level and really delve into it. And, of course, I appreciate people's opinions. I'd love the pushback. I'd love to be critiqued. I'd love to hear how people see it differently, because I think the more we talk about this, the more we're going to land in a more positive spot.
Well, I highly recommend that folks take you up on that, giving you a shout, just reaching out through a website, whether it's to get advice as a candidate and potentially work with you guys and get some advice for how campaigns can do a better job reaching out to their voters and communicating with them, or whether it's to share ideas you've got on how to better reach millennials. Take her up on that. Bonnie's an incredible resource that I definitely take advantage of on a regular basis. She's awesome and very, very happy to talk with folks. So do not let that idea go idly by.
Thank you. A pleasure. Thank you.
Well, you have a wonderful day, Bonnie. Thank you so much for coming back on with us and for sharing so much about how we can talk to millennials.
Thank you, Raz, and thanks for all the work you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Please subscribe and rate us on iTunes to help spread the word. We'll be back with you next week with more campaign insights from My Campaign Coach.